When news first broke that Celtics head coach Ime Udoka was suspended for a year for, quote, violations of organizational policies, there was talk of the possibility he would never coach in the NBA again. But now, although unconfirmed as of this taping, reporting first by ESPN, then later The Globe, indicates the Brooklyn Nets are about to hire him as their head coach. I guess never means 5 weeks. And if it doesn't happen, it's clear that it's only because of all the blowback since the news first leaked. Either way, it's once again raising questions about the circumstances surrounding his suspension here in Boston. The Celtics have said very little about the whole thing, even as several of its female employees were unfairly doxxed by internet investigator wannabes. But reports indicate an independent investigation found that Udoka used crude language in his dialogue with a female subordinate prior to the start of an improper workplace relationship with the woman. So, less than a month and a half later, do the Nets know something we don't, or do they just think what Udoka did was not that big a deal? And what does this likely move say about how women working in sports and playing are treated? I'm joined by sports journalist Shira Springer, lecturer at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and Nefertiti Walker, who played Division I women's basketball at Georgia Tech, then Stetson, was the top 40 WNBA pre-draft selection, signed to play professionally in Germany, but opted to pursue a PhD instead. She is now Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and a professor of sport management at UMass Amherst. Nefertiti, great to see you. Shira, great to see you.
Likewise.
Happy to be here.
Great. Nefertiti, let me start with you. What was your initial reaction to, I guess, the shortest one-year suspension in history?
You know, it was interesting, right? Because again, there's so much has been kept undercover as far as the details of the suspension and the details of what happened that caused the suspension. But it certainly tells us the hierarchy of oppressions that we're willing to accept in the workplace. I mean, in my opinion, in some ways, the Nets moving forward with Udoka suggests that, one, perhaps this is a distraction from the Kyrie drama that's happening right now. And if they are using this particular incident, which is really sort of deeply entrenched in sexist ideals and stereotypes about women in the workplace, to distract people from Kyrie and the anti-Semitism that's been tied to some of his comments in recent posts, then certainly they're suggesting that this is less of an issue for them than that.
You know,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, which just suggests, again, women are falling at sort of the bottom of the totem pole for oppression in the workplace.
You know, and for those who don't know, Kyrie Irving was the retweeting of a post with about an anti-Semitic film about which the Nets, by the way, did absolutely nothing, nothing. And then this comes up. So my initial take on this, Shira, is not only is it outrageous, but what message is being sent to the women who work in the office at the Nets, a kind of a facility? What is the answer to that?
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point about what message is being sent, because this is a workplace. This is where women expect to be treated fairly and to be valued. And I think that one of the messages being sent is that you're not valued enough. I think that's across sports when you have these issues, whether it's players who have committed acts of domestic violence, and I'm not equating them, but when there are issues with men behaving badly, men doing inappropriate things, whether it's sexual harassment, domestic violence, etc., and then you bring them back into the workplace. I'm thinking of Deshaun Watson, too, with the Cleveland Browns.
Who's going to be in the field in a month.
Yeah, exactly. So when these things happen, I think you are making a statement about how little you value women or how little you respect them in the workplace, and create a whole range of other issues for those women.
You know, Nefertiti, I'm glad that Shira said across sports, because for those watching who are not huge sports fans who think this is an outlier, I have two words for them: Dallas Cowboys, also Washington football team. This is not an outlier. There's a whole history of women who work for, not on the field or on the court, we'll get to that in a minute, work for these organizations, being treated like second and third class citizens, no?
Oh, absolutely. And some of the research that we've done here at UMass, and my former doc student, who's now a professor at Stonehill College, has done this work as well with me. We've basically uncovered some of the reasons why women are treated this way, right? There's a stereotype that the women that work in sport are there because they want to sleep with the athletes or the high-level executives that are leading the sport teams. So when these things happen, typically people blame the woman. She must have been the one that encouraged this relationship. And that's one of the reasons why it's so easy for these men to move on and get another job, because at the root of this is that organizations don't take sexism very seriously, and sport organizations in particular.
Yeah, and also, what you just said reminded me, Shira, before we move on to the field or the court, is if I read the word consensual one more time in the news reporting on this when it initially broke, no question there's a guy high on the totem pole with a woman who is by definition not on his level, and it was consensual, indicating to me either an intentional or an unintentional total misunderstanding of what Nefertiti was just talking about.
Yeah, of the power dynamics.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's playing exactly into those stereotypes. And I think going with what Nefertiti was saying, there's another issue at play here. Which is that when you hire women in these sports jobs, often people see that as checking off an item. We need to have to get the optics right. We need to have a woman in this executive position, or we need to have a female presence in some of the executive level positions. And so there's one or two women there. There's not a critical mass, and that also leads to issues.
Can we go from the office to the field or the court or the mat, whatever? Can you remind, everybody knows the story about Larry Nassar, this monster who's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. Not one woman, not a dozen, 150, yep. And then the incredible testimony from some very high-profile gymnasts in front of Congress. Talk about courage. It was unbelievable. Can you remind people why this was allowed to go on for so long?
It was allowed to go on because nobody believed the young gymnasts when they made reports against Nassar. That's the bottom line. These young gymnasts were not believed, and there was a group, quite frankly, of male leaders, in large part, who were passing along these complaints, covering up these complaints by these young gymnasts. Why? Because they were worried about sponsor reaction. They saw these young gymnasts as a way to enhance the glory of the Olympic movement, of the U.S. Gymnastics Association. So there were a lot of factors in play, but basically, bottom line, they didn't believe the young girls, and there was a culture where these young women were not valued.
And I shouldn't have assumed people know Larry Nassar was obviously a doctor who was sexually abusing these women in serial fashion. Nefertiti, to show the hurdles that women who have pleas here for safety are unheard. It wasn't just the infrastructure of the gym community. When I read the story a few months ago about how they reported this information to the FBI in Indianapolis, which did absolutely nothing. And it turns out the reason they did nothing is the head of the office in Indianapolis had applied for a job with the Gymnastics Association of America. I mean, it's almost like inescapable cover-up and corruption that these women are up against.
Exactly. And, part of the problem is certainly the stereotypes that exist about women in the workplace and the reasons why they're there. But also, I think the power of sport and the infrastructure of sport and sort of the socio-historical context of sport being a place created for the advancement of men. And we're trying to undo that now with hiring women in high-ranking positions and the policies that are being changed and the research that's being done to uncover the deep levels of sexism that exist. But the reality is, this is how, one, you get a job in sport, by who you know and your networking. And sport has been a place that's been dominated by men and toxic masculinity.
And I would add to what Nefertiti is saying, that not only has it been dominated by men, but it's men in positions of power, in decision-making positions, in leadership positions that perpetuate a culture that is sexist and discriminates against women and oppresses women at every turn and creates cultures that lead to situations like what happened with Larry Nassar. And so there's a lot of hurdles to overcome, and part of those hurdles, maybe several of those hurdles, involve getting women to occupy, creating pipelines for women to occupy leadership positions where they can make decisions in the best interest of other women in the workplace and, quite frankly, of young female athletes, as was the case with Larry Nassar.
Yeah, I want to talk about fixes a little bit more in a minute, but just for people watching who think, well, this whole notion that female athletes aren't safe, if we had a 2-hour program, we could give you 2 hours of examples, and fast forward to the National Women's Soccer League, Sally Yates, former acting attorney general. Here's what part of the report she did, an extensive report. Our investigation has revealed a league in which abuse and misconduct, verbal and emotional abuse and sexual misconduct had become systemic, spanning multiple teams, coaches, and victims. So this notion that that was then, this is now, is total BS. You know, Nefertiti, what seems to me is that the odds of getting caught, outed, and seriously punished, unlike unseriously punished, like Deshaun Watson we talked about a minute ago, $250 million contract, and big deal, he misses, what, 9 or 10 or 11 games. The odds of all those things happening are so small, there's almost no disincentive to bad behavior. Did I get that out? You know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, I agree completely. Not only are the odds of being punished very slim, but also the institution itself supports the cover-up of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, time and time again, we see in some ways people are rewarded by having bigger contracts, and Deshaun Watson by being able to move on and coach, you know, mega superstars in the example of Udoka. So, you know, I think, yes, the punitive piece of it is lessened, and it does not happen very often, but also the reward piece of it, of getting out of a particular messy situation and getting a better job and a better opportunity and more money happens way too often.
Sure, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say there was, over the summer, a peer-reviewed study about the consequences that NFL players suffer as a result of domestic violence arrests, and it found that the career consequences were quote-unquote negligible, and that in fact 75% of the players, and they didn't have to be stars, they were, you know, it could be average or slightly below average, that 75% of the players who were arrested for domestic violence suffered no long-term career consequences because of those arrests. I think that speaks volumes about the priorities and the message that the NFL is sending despite all its campaigning and optics surrounding, you know, prevention of domestic violence.
You know, Nefertiti, a minute or two ago, Shira offered some fixes, for lack of a better expression. And I don't know if maybe I was going to be too nervous to say what she hinted at. You need more women in these high places and fewer men. It's not a guarantee, but it sure as hell is a step in the right direction. Beyond that, assuming you subscribe to that notion, what else needs to be done?
Well, I think you need more women just, you know, for equity reasons, right? But I also think you need more men who prescribe to the ideals of equity as well. There are plenty of men out there who have very strong feelings about moving forward in equitable ways. But until we get to a point where we even have equitable access for women, that really should be the focus, as Shira said. I also think when these types of issues surface, then we can't expect an organization who is looking out for themselves, who is trying to win games, to then also be able to appropriately oversee themselves. Yeah. There needs to be an external organization that is able to come in and really oversee these situations and be able to assess and make recommendations to the institutions themselves, as opposed to having the institutions try to, in some ways, police themselves, which we've seen does not work for any of them. So I think that's the first step.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point about organizations trying to police themselves and that not being a good solution. One thing that we've seen with the NWSL is the establishment of a players' union, the NWSL Players Association. So I think in addition to getting more women in leadership positions in these league and team structures, as well as cultivating more male allies who care about issues of equity, establishing strong players' associations where the players have a voice in how the league is run and safety measures that are installed is another key aspect and potential solution.
And we can end, by the way, on the fact that one of the women who reported the abuse and was ignored in the National Women's Soccer League is now chair of the committee that is going to oversee the fixes you're all talking about. Nefertiti and Shira, I really appreciate your time, both of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.